This is the Ur Museum. I'm in the entrance to the Ur Museum, and I've got a laptop. So at the end, I might actually take you down the hallway, and you can see a couple of other Stanford sculptures we have down the hallway. But just to briefly introduce you to Helen, we'll hear about Helen a little bit later. But she's a sculptor on my left. Yep, and then she's kind of in conversation here with Aphrodite. Um, Helen is by Stanford. We'll talk more about her later. Aphrodite is from the British Museum, actually. It's on loan from the British Museum. And it had been there for about 150 years before that. They found it in their excavations in Cyrene in North Africa. And so she's probably second century AC, but we call her Aphrodite because Cyrene was a Greek city. So that's the Greek name of the goddess that the Romans called Venus. And she's got Eros with her. And then there's me. And the lighting's much better for them because it's the entrance to the museum than it is for me, but that's the way it should be. So just so you get your situation, but as I say, we can move a little bit later. So anyway, so Eric Stanford is best known in Reading and maybe better known to many of you. Maybe some of you were his friends. I hope you were, and if so, get in touch afterwards and we can talk. But for those of you who didn't have the chance to meet him, probably best known through the striking Spanish Civil War monument shown here in its newer location in Forbury Gardens, where it was reinstalled actually on the 10th of May, 2015. And so that's, we're almost on time for that. We're just a few days before that. And in fact, its original installation, it was originally unveiled in 1990, on the 5th of May of 1990, again, almost, well, a bit over 36 years ago, near the hexagon. But it was then, moved for whatever reasons. And so Eric Stanford actually was in attendance at the rededication, and he wasn't, I believe he had just moved to Devizes then, but he had been a long-term resident of Reading and had a lot of friends here, so almost local boy really, and had brought up his family here, etc. I think he was also a town councillor, so he would be very happy for us to go off and vote, and I'll rush off and vote after this. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about his politics or anyone's politics, but the sculpture itself is very political. I start with it because it's the big, shall we say, elephant in the room at Reading, and it's important for his role vis-a-vis the University of Reading. It was he sculpted it in 1990, which was after a career doing a few other things. In fact, when he was getting back to sculpture, and it remembers 10 local men who were named on the monument, 3 of whom died and 7 of whom were injured, but returned from the Spanish Civil War from 36 to 39. And as indicated on the inscription, they died for liberty, and the image itself is an allegory. Allegory being, in art speak, saying, and in fact, that is from the ancient Greek word, and since I teach ancient Greek, why not saying something in another way or with something else. And so the something here is a mother with her dead child, mourning her dead child. And the mother is, of course, Spain, and she's mourning the dead republic, which is essentially her child. This much I know, I'm told, and in fact can read on the monument. There's inscriptions indicating most of what I've just said to you, and confirmed with Eric when I met him in 2017. But other than that, I'm much less expert than probably some of you, because as you heard from my CV or whatever Hannah told you, I'm a professor of classical archaeology. So I usually deal with things like Aphrodite, much older. Anyway, but if we just move on, excuse me while I take control. Yeah, there we are. I've told you that much. It's important to look also at his public works, which are, in fact, I'm sorry to say, not well enough known to the English public, but certainly in Devizes in Wiltshire, where he moved later in his life, and in fact passed away. He became somewhat notorious at the turn of the century because they excuse me for the typo on the page, but for the Millennium Cross and Devizes in their churchyard there, St. John's churchyard, excuse me, it was created, commissioned by a an amazing conglomeration or cooperation, I guess, of lots of different organizations in 2001. And when it was destroyed, not destroyed, but attacked and mutilated by someone who randomly went out there in 2006, actually, it was a bit of a brouhaha in devices about fixing it up again. It was going to cost something like £3,500 to fix it, and the council didn't see it as being something covered by their insurance because of the fact that it was commissioned by a consortium, and they went out to local people, and there was a really big deal. But even before that, before they even commissioned that, they had commissioned another statue, which was a nude by the wharf side, and there were some people who thought, I guess it was they were too traditional, and they didn't particularly like the idea of having a nude out in public. And so they had to rethink to get the Millennium Cross. And I tell you this story partly because he clearly was an artist. He didn't hide away. He was out there in the face of, he was the one who found the mutilation actually and reported it. And which, I mean, must have, almost broken his heart after the, 2 years he spent working on this beautiful cross. Which, I haven't talked about it, but you can't see the details, but it's got both biblical and historical scenes. And so this story also tells us he did the full range of things. He was deeply interested in history that included biblical things. Of course, he was commissioned for a few other religious things. I'll get onto that later. And he also, the whole range of sort of modernist sculpture, looking at ancient sources, nudes, conservative things for churchyards, the whole gamut, really. The one thing that unified it was playing with stone. And he was a direct stone sculptor. I'm not a great expert either in sculpting or talking about direct stone sculpting, but it's sort of what they did in antiquity. You do it directly, you let the stone work with you, shall we say. Anyway, so that having introduced you to one of his later works and devises and his most famous work in Reading, and there's a couple of others in Reading at the South Street Art Center. There's one just outside that's in a slightly unfortunate position where I don't think it gets enough attention. And I believe there's one in a graveyard in Caversham. And I'm afraid I only just have that at the top of my brain. And there might be others who can tell us more about that later. Again, I'm having a slightly hard time moving on. There we go. So I get ahead of myself. Let's go back to who Eric Stanford was and what he was doing. He was born in 1932 and unfortunately passed away just a few years ago in, COVID times. But he had been quite unwell for some time before that, so we can't necessarily blame COVID. This is a beautiful image that, of course, I found on the web, as one does, of him working on a very famous monument by his in a sense, one of his teachers, but more importantly, tutor, the guy who he worked alongside, who is Eric Kennington, who was a fellow of the Royal Academy in 1959 and unfortunately passed away in 1960. Eric himself was never got to the Royal Academy, I don't believe, but a fellow of the Royal Society of British Sculptors. Also, besides, his role within the world of sculpture, which actually is not that big, he was, and certainly stone sculpture, he was also very big in Reading's 20th century art scene, as you will see. But he began his studies at St. Martin's School of Art in London, Central St. Martin's, as it's now called. And he actually transferred here, came here, according to when we interviewed him in 2018, because of his brother Alan, who came here to study in the education school. And there he enrolled and he started studying sculpture under A.C. Carter, who, having started his career as a trained silversmith, was both adept at lots of different things, but also maybe more traditional than his teacher at Central St. Martin's, who was Jose Alberti, who was a Basque sculptor who had, in fact, been a refugee from the Spanish Civil War. So in that sense, I don't know how much that fit into the fact that he was commissioned to do his most famous monument in Reading as a Spanish Civil War monument. But, so it goes full circle, shall we say. And also goes full circle because Kennington is best known as a war artist. And in fact, Stanford, having worked on things with Kennington, dealt with war a fair amount. But this monument that he's working on here is part of the huge stone mural that decorates the James Watt Engineering Building, which is at University of Glasgow, called The Progress of Science. And if you look this up, of course, you'll find they say Eric Kennington made it, and they don't necessarily say anything about Eric Stanford. But Stanford had to finish it because Kennington was not doing so well. And so this is a big training job for him, shall we say, because after he had finished his degree, though he went into basically an apprenticeship and worked alongside and helped Kennington till the end of his career. And in fact, after his career, and this is one of those things that he worked on. And this is my own photograph, and this one too, a little detail where I noted with interest this bearded man with an anvil. Granted, he's at a metal forge. You can see the flames and everything coming up. The flames we might get back to with one of our statues here in Reading, so it sort of rang a bell for me that way. But also just the man working hard with his hammer at the anvil just made me think it's almost a self-portrait of Eric Stanford himself. Though back then, did he have a beard? Well, anyway, you get the idea. And another one very nearby, I used to live in South Oxfordshire, and this is the Church of St. Peter and Paul, I think it's called, in Checkenden, with a monument. The Rothbar Memorial was commissioned in 1949 by Herbert Rothbart, who, in honor of his wife Maud. And in fact, it wasn't finished before either Herbert's or Kennington's death in 1960. And so, of course, Stanford ended up finishing it. And so it was commissioned then, though it was meant to be just for Maud, it was commissioned it was dedicated both, and the inscription says it, both to Herbert and to Maud, who, together. And it's in the next to the congregation on the north wall of the nave of the church. So it's entering, as you do with that church actually from the south side, it's almost the first thing you see. It's incredibly obvious and clear. And again, you see some of those swirling forms and some sort of modernist element of the female visage there, but also some rather antique-looking architecture that she's standing in, this angel. But it's generally known either as the Rothbarth Memorial or the Angel of Checkenden. I do recommend if any of you were local, go see it. And if those of you from farther away, come to Oxfordshire and see some of our beautiful churches, which we have many. But just again, I keep trying to get back to who he was, what he did. So after he graduated with his degree of fine art from this university, back then it was called it was called the School of Art. It was part of the university. It's changed over time, what it's called. But anyway, it was a very, very important school of art for practical art, especially, which obviously he was good at. And then he worked for the Berkshire College of Art in the 60s. And then from 68 up till 89, in fact, was the keeper of art at Reading Museum and Art Gallery. And I think this is really quite a testament to the range of different art-related things that a sculptor can do. And then really from 1990, then he got back into sculpture sort of more full scale. And that was when he was working on the Spanish Civil War monument that, as I said, was unveiled in 1990. And that gets us back to the University of Reading, because the university let him use some of their space actually around the education school. And because he needed, studio space in Reading, where he was going to do this. And he was playing with a lot of different forms of different styles of sculpture, different sculptures, so Bath stone, Portland stone, etc. And trying out different things. And since at the time he was sort of really, he wasn't in what we would call a classicizing phase because he wasn't trying to make any of his art look remotely classical, but rather he was really interested in mythic themes. He was interested in the stories. And so he dabbled and did a lot of work concentrating on particular themes that he was reading around and thinking about. And it was at that time that two of the works that he made and finished kind of sat on a shelf doing nothing. And he gave them to the University of Reading to thank them for having let him use their space. And then Naomi Labens found them sitting on a shelf and said, what are these doing here? What should we do with them? And thankfully got into conversation with my colleague Emma Aston, who's now our head of department, who appreciated his art, modernist art, and especially how the modernist art fits in nicely with the building that we're in. If those of you who don't know it, we're in the Edith Morley building, finished and inaugurated by Her Majesty, the late Queen, in 57. And at the same time, interested obviously in the classical themes that he was investigating. And we said, what are these sculptures? And this is where we get to the ones that we have in the museum. On the left, an image of Helen, but you can see her over here. And in the middle, the front and back sides actually of Protesilaus. I know that's a bit of a mouthful. Any of you who can't say his name, you just have to come study Greek with me. Protesilaus was a Trojan War hero, and in fact, perhaps the most heroic of them all. He was the first to land on the beach at Troy. And so this is a really interesting concentrated study, actually, of a very complicated character who a lot of people who study classics don't know anything about anyway, actually. On the other hand, Helen, a face that launched 1,000 ships, etc., most people know about her from the Trojan War. She's the whole reason the Trojan War existed, because Aphrodite, yes, it's all her fault. She was the one who wanted to win the judgment of Paris when poor little shepherd Prince Paris of Troy had to choose the most beautiful goddess. And of course, he chose Aphrodite, but not least because she bribed him. And she said, I'll give you the most beautiful woman in the world. And then she had to make good on that promise, but it turned out the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, and she was already married to Menelaus. Menelaus was brother of Agamemnon. They're both kings and generals, and Agamemnon said, yep, okay, let's go out to Troy and let's just get her back. Because you don't go stealing someone's wife just because Aphrodite told you to. But anyway, that's a version of the story. There's other versions of the story. And I hope you will agree with me that this is a striking image of Helen that isn't necessarily the face that you see in a lot of the traditional representations of her. And we can get into that a little bit more later. But first, going back to how I even know him. Well, I know him because we got this sculpture. We said, yes, we like this. And then we started reading about him and learning about him. And then we found out that our friend and colleague, and in fact, the designer of this museum from 2004 to 5, Martin Andrews, who had worked with him when he was museum designer at the Museum of Reading. In fact, he was friends and still in contact with Eric Stanford, who he went then to visit in his home in Devizes, and it took me down to meet him. So that was great. So I got to meet Eric and his lovely wife. I saw her in an earlier picture. Her name is Helen. And so my first question to him was, oh, your portrait of Helen. Is it Helen? And then I met her and I thought, no, it's not a portrait of that Helen. But anyway, maybe he was particularly interested in that name. I just want to go back a slide because there's something that I didn't show you. Oh, if I go from the start. Yes, I'm going to continue to share. Sorry about that. There was something I didn't point out that I showed you, which is this lovely family portrait here. That's Helen, and I guess Eric in the upper right, and their 4 children. And so, as well as all of this, and whatever his civic duty and everything, he was also a big family man and apparently a great host. And those sweets that you saw on the table that they shared with us, yeah, they were very good hosts then. But apparently, lots of people go out to their house for dinner and everything. So, a good time was had. But anyway, that I think that's enough from me in terms of slides. I'm going to end the show. And not least, did we get rid of the slides?
Yep, they're gone now, Amy. Yeah.
But I'll say here, both so I can, shall we say, focus a little bit more on Helen and then maybe take you down the hall to the other sculptors. We have Protesilaus, and we also have another sculpture called Memnon. Memnon was a king of Egypt. And indeed, this Memnon is standing in the sands of Egypt, a little bit like Ozymandias, in fact, if you know from the poem. But so we're lucky enough to have these three sculptures. Again, the first two on loan from the University Art Collection, but Memnon on loan from a private donor who was just lent it to us anonymously, but we happened to find about in our research when we were talking about Stanford. And there's plenty of other stuff out there. And what I didn't show you was when I visited him 2018, so that's 2 years before he died. Oh my gosh, there was so much beautiful sculpture all around his house and their studio. He had a little sort of shed-like studio next to it. So there's a lot of stuff still out there and maybe out there on the market. I'm not able to buy these things particularly myself, but if I could. But yeah, I asked him about the sort of cubism of Helen here, because that's she does look to me like if you're being influenced by any art style from the 20th century. Again, I'm not really an expert in these sort of things. And he said, "Oh, that's kind of funny. I didn't really think about that way." And he did credit his time with his teacher, the Basque sculptor, who did, I think, a much more alternative modernist sort of aesthetic than his later teachers, if you see what I mean. So it's earlier in his education that he got this sort of, well, stop and think about ideas um, about beauty. If she's got a perfect Roman nose, as they call it, actually, so that fits into the classical thing, but literally looks like she was cut out of a block of stone. And in fact, she was. And that's when we got onto the issue about the direct stone sculpture, that he worked with the stone, right? And this particular stone, I just have to double check if I look at the label. I believe it is Bath stone. Oh no, it's Clipsham. It's Clipsham. Excuse me. It's from Clipsham. The other one down there is Bath, right? And so he worked with, as I said, different stones. And the nice thing about the Clipsham stone is it's got you can almost see a lot of these limestone type things. They're made out of deposits of seashells and things like that. And if you get up there close, you can see that. I mean, it's a very highly polished surface. I don't know how well you can see this, but we've got sort of, it almost looks like a sawdust pile, a pile of sawdust or whatever. But he's done this wonderful contrast of a very stippled surface, I think the word is, with he's drilling in, hard like that for her fantastic, almost bouffant sort of hairdo, and then the smooth surface again with a very striated sort of look in the stone that covers her face, etc. But he was never too far away from swirling surfaces. And so I absolutely love the ear treatment there, that she's she's got two or three loving curves articulating her ear, a little bit less naturalistically than some portraits, but more artfully, shall we say. Um, anyway, we put her here because we wanted to highlight her. She fit into the space well. Aphrodite moved over a little bit to make space for her because Aphrodite had been standing here since the British Museum lent her to us in 2005. And yeah, that's that. If you have any questions about the other ones, I can take you down the hall, but why don't we just turn over to questions now, Hannah, and see what you and others want to hear about.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amy, for that super interesting overview. hearing more about his training and his background and, his relationship with Kennington, but also the provenance of some of the artworks that are on display in the Ure and in the art collection now. And I'm always extremely envious of other curators who get to meet artists when they're still alive and get to talk about, their processes and all these different materials that he was using. And actually, you have already answered a few of the questions which are in the chat, because Caroline wanted to know more about the family portrait, the family painting, which I haven't seen before either. That's fascinating. And that is still in a private collection, did you say?
Well, no, it was in their home. When I went to visit
Right.
them, it was in, I mean, the picture I showed you actually is, you can just barely see the triple set of alcohol bottles, decanters, right in front of it. So it's like on their sideboard in their dining room, which is absolutely perfect place to have it. And I'm sorry to say, I kept in touch with Helen for a few years actually, and after his death, but I've sort of lost touch with her, and I should have gotten back in touch with her in light of this conversation, but I've just been too busy. I'm sorry.
No,
And
it's
so,
it's understandable.
I mean, because it's a big family, and there was an awful lot of art in that house, I would imagine it was probably dispersed among family members. Or she might still be, still be living with it on her sideboard, if you see what I mean. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was it. I do see one question there about children producing any kind of artwork.
Yeah.
I believe that one of them was an artist. I cannot remember the name. I probably took some very good notes when I visited them, but that was a few years back, and I'm sorry I haven't studied up on all of that. But
What
maybe
this
one of these
is
days.
what this is revealing to me, Amy, though, is there's still, and do you agree with this? Do you think there is still more kind of critical work to be done on
Oh
Stanford?
my gosh, critical work biography. I
Yeah.
mean, I glanced. There is a Wikipedia article. If anyone's good at editing Wikipedia articles, fix it. Even if you can, I mean, add to it any little bit of information, really. And I mean, not that Wikipedia is the most important source in the world, but well, it kind of is. It's the first place that people go to look for things, and is also not well represented on Reading monuments. In fact, that South Street Art Center one, everyone knows about it, but it's not listed in Reading's monuments.
Exactly. And I noticed on Art UK, which many of the people in the audience might be familiar with, there's not many images for his work. And actually, we've got someone in the chat who's saying that there are artworks which he made for, I don't know if they're still there, but for St. John's Primary School and also for Leighton Park School in Reading, which is
Oh, I didn't
interesting.
know about those, but that I absolutely, and in fact, could there be a family connection there that those are schools that maybe his children went to or something like that?
Yeah, possibly. And I think there is kind of a strong kind of artistic alumni at Leighton Park School as well, which warrants further study. Um, there is something which you touched upon, Amy, when you were talking about Bath stone and Portland stone, and that's a question in the chat, which was about do you know if he had a preferred type of stone, or was he kind of just we don't
No.
know?
No, I do know.
Oh, you do know.
I asked him, and he said no. He liked the variety of opportunities that they presented to him. That some of them suited themselves better to, But I think he did a lot of Portland stone, maybe more Portland stone, possibly because it was just easier to get.
Yeah, yeah,
But he liked experimenting. I mean, that he was a genuine. I think that's the difference between craftsman and artist. He was both, but
yeah.
but both his experimentation and his constantly rethinking, and working around problems, was really his, I mean, psychological problems as well as, not just
Yeah,
there's a stone problem or whatever, I think those are the things that make him both a bit academic, but especially an artist, proper artist.
yeah,
He wasn't just hammering these things out for whoever wanted to decorate their, churchyard.
yeah. And actually, relating to that, we have a question which was about whether we have any drawings for his sculptures in the university collections. We do
Well,
have
you could
some
answer
in,
that better than I, but
yeah,
photographs, when I went to him, he did do preliminary drawings, but he didn't really stick to them too well. And he would go back, he would work on these things over a long period of time, and he would change his mind as he was going along. And so he did show me, I could have shared with you, but this is kind of supposed to be a short presentation. And I don't know, they just let me take pictures because I was there, not because I was going to give a presentation about them, but I was interested. But they did show me some of his huge notebooks, that had lots of drawings of various stages of each sculpture that he was working on. And he, certainly in 2018, he still had a fair amount of them. And who knows, if you're interested, maybe we could hunt down the family and see if University of Reading might be an appropriate repository for anything if they don't know what to do with it.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. All of this is providing kind of, stimulus for further research, I think, absolutely. And we do have some of his drawings in the collection, but as you say, they are preliminary drawings and they're really interesting because I think you can get a kind of insight into his working process and the way that he was thinking. They are unfinished from what I can remember, but definitely I think they are worthy of display at some point for kind of unpicking those processes and introducing people to his work. Caroline has actually said that she doesn't remember Helen telling her that their children went to Leighton Park, but Helen did say that he liked Portland stone from A.F. Jones stonemason in Reading,
Oh,
which is very interesting. So yeah, it's great to
again,
hear from
he
those of
could
you
get
in the
it.
audience. Yeah, great to hear from those of you who knew him. Now, I
Mhm.
realise, Amy, we're running out of time as we always do. So before it would be great to see, if it's okay with you, the statue of. Now I'm going to do this terrible disservice.
Protestaleia.
Protesilaus. Protesilaus. It would be great to see
Sure.
that sculpture, if that's okay. But before we do go over, oh, actually, let's go over there first. Yeah.
Well, I can walk and you can keep talking while I'm walking because it's down the hallway.
Well, what I was hoping you would share with our audience is, if we talk a bit more about your role as a curator at the Your Museum and how you first kind of like how you started to think about placing Stanford's work in dialogue with those, you know, ancient sculptures that you're displaying. Like, how do you want visitors to engage with his work? Because, of course, when you go into the museum, you have Aphrodite and you have Helen of Troy, and they're two very different works. And you've explained the kind of deeper levels in which they're talking, but it is a real kind of, the visitor is really faced with them immediately.
I didn't prepare this well enough, but I'm going to put my laptop on a chair looking at Protesilaus. Can you see him now? There he is.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm going to start to answer your question while you focus on him. So, um, Aphrodite, as you've seen, well, I'll just turn back so you can see again. There she is, welcoming you to the open door of the museum. Well, the door's only half open now, but we have Martin Andrews to thank. Well, we have both Martin Andrews and Duffrey Williams. Some of you might know Martin, but you don't know Duffrey probably. But he was then the keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum, and he was on our advisory board. And he came to our launch of our website, actually. Here's a shout out for our website. We still have a website, not the same one, but anyway, in 2014, when Martin was working on the redesign of the museum. And before that, the museum was a sort of mustard colored space that no one knew was a museum because it was behind these doors at the end of the hallway, right? And so he created this portal that is actually decorated with drawings of columns because a museum is often represented throughout the world with these Greek columns. So for a museum of Greek archaeology, we might as well have Greek columns. So we have those as our portal in this mid-century modern building. And Martin had done sort of a mock-up of that with a column at the center beckoning you into the museum, sort of a fake column, like a plastic column or whatever. And Duffrey looked at that and said, well, that's a brilliant idea, but because I see you want to draw people in, but why did you put a statue there? And I looked at Duffrey and I said, that's a bit, a fake statue would be a bit duff. And Duffrey, no pun intended, sorry, that was said, well, I don't mean fake statue because of course he's keeper of Greek and Roman antiquities at the British Museum, and they had stuff in the basement that they needed to move basically out of the basement and get people appreciating them. And so I went on a shopping trip and I found 5 statues, and this was the one that when I went back, pictures and drawings and whatever, everyone agreed that Aphrodite, even though she doesn't have a head, she'd be really good here. So she's
Hmm.
been there ever since. But if we fast forward to incorporating Stanford into it, well, Emma and I had a conversation, and I said, well, I don't have room in the museum. It's a small museum. I can't move things to make room for modern things, as much as I'd love to have them. But I love the idea of Helen in conversation with Aphrodite because their stories are so intertwined with each other. A lot of people only know about what Aphrodite does and about her role as a goddess of beauty and love. She was a goddess of other things too, by the way, but they know of that through Helen, and that sort of intensified the modern reception of Aphrodite as a goddess of love and beauty. And I realize you can't see me, so I'm going to hunch down a little bit next to Professor Les. And so, yeah, I just thought if they're just going to be sort of sitting there looking at each other for the rest of eternity, why not? And then when we put them next to each other, it was beautiful because the Clipsham stone, though it's completely different from the Pentelic marble out of which Aphrodite's made, it's still got that golden sort of hue, that golden ivory sort of hue. So it works, and our font happens to be the right color too. So it works perfectly. Oh, by the way, in our font, the Euro Museum of Greek Archaeology is Venus. That is the name of that font. So it's all one big beautiful ensemble. So that was great. But then Emma said, oh, well, maybe we could put the others down the hallway. And so we've got Fred Vandegeer, the wonderful conservator, to build us these little
Plinths.
on top of,
Yeah.
whatever bases that protect the statues. The only downside of poor practice layers, and if you look on Art UK, you can see the back side of it, is that the back was sculpted. And it's interesting, the sides and the back. And we don't have enough space to be able to show him. He really should be at the center, if you see what
Mm.
a walk around space, but the health and safety people wouldn't let us do that. So there he is. Maybe we should turn him around from time to time, and then you can see what's going on there. But if we just go back quickly to poor Memnon, he's in the similar matching one, right? And so yeah, so they're there. I don't know how many students pay attention or look at them or think about them, but the labels were written by students because that's a very important part of answering your question about being a curator, as well as being a professor. Our first opportunity when we were thinking about Leighton Park being interested in art and everything, I was thinking, oh, good, they can get their students to do research on this. That's how I think, being a teacher as well as a curator. So
Amazing.
yeah, we squeezed them in basically as best we could. And since then, we've added little casts. Fred's made some more matching plinths. There's a lapis head given to us by Semni Caruso from the National Museum in Athens. It's a cast, but it's been here forever since she gave it to Annie Ure. And so he's finally got his own space. And there's another cast, and people might recognize this. Again, going back to, she might be Aphrodite. She's figure D from the Parthenon. And people argue about whether it's Aphrodite or something else. And this one, not only it's a cast also, but she was in the art school, and I guess, I don't know, they need another home for her, and she was a bit dirty. And so one of my students did a conservation internship with Fred and worked on her and did the label too. So that's another great student project. And then we just keep on getting more and more art from either the cast collection, the art museum, or sorry, the art school doesn't like them anymore, or there's also stuff from the British Museum. And of course, we've got our lovely mini Jane Hardmans down and around the corner. Nice drawings of classical themes, because forever and ever, sculptors and illustrators, people doing drawing classes, they have used ancient models to copy, to draw, to inspire them.